September 14th, 1869, Boston, Massachusetts. January 7th, 1871, Danvers State Hospital. The doctor slammed Catherine's file onto the table, grabbed her by the jaw, and forced her face upward. "Say one more word," he snarled, "and I will have you strapped down until you rot." She was 9 years old. She did not flinch. She looked straight into his eyes and whispered the name of his dead son, a secret buried 6 years deep. The doctor screamed. Subscribe now, drop your city below, and stay until the very end. The Doyle family had come to America with nothing but 2 suitcases, a rosary worn smooth from too many desperate prayers, and the stubborn, aching hope that Boston would be kinder to them than Cork had ever been. Patrick Doyle worked the docks 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, his hands cracked and bleeding by Thursday of every week. His wife, Maura, took in laundry from the wealthier families in the neighborhood, pressing other people's fine linens with an iron that burned her wrists and left marks that never fully faded. They were Irish, and in Boston in the 1860s, being Irish meant being one step above nothing at all. The signs in shop windows read, "No Irish need apply." Landlords turned them away without a word. Foremen cut their wages and dared them to complain. Patrick and Maura swallowed it all in silence, day after day, because they had no choice. They had Catherine to think about. Catherine Mary Doyle was born on the 3rd of March, 1862, in a 2-room tenement on Hanover Street. From the very beginning, she was the kind of child that made strangers stop and smile at her without knowing why. Bright brown eyes, a quick, easy laugh. She had learned to read before she was 5 years old. She would sit beside her father in the evenings and trace her small finger carefully across the words in his Bible, sounding each one out with absolute seriousness, her brow furrowed like she was solving the most important problem in the world. Patrick would press his hand flat against his chest, like his heart might burst from the love of it. Those were good years. Those were the years the Doyle family could still breathe freely. That stopped in September of 1869. It was a Tuesday morning, early, the sky still gray, and Maura was the first to hear it. She was standing at the stove, boiling water, when Catherine walked into the kitchen and stopped. Just stood there. Her face was completely blank. Not the blank of a child still half asleep, not the blank of sickness. Something else. Something that looked like emptied out. "Catherine, love," Maura said, keeping her voice careful and steady. "Are you all right?" Catherine turned and looked at her mother, and Maura felt it immediately. A cold drop moving slowly down the back of her neck, as if someone had pressed a piece of ice directly to her spine. The child's eyes were wrong. Not wrong in the way of fever or infection. Wrong in the way of distance. Like looking into the eyes of someone who had traveled very, very far, and was not entirely certain they had come all the way back. "He buried him under the floorboards," Catherine said. Maura set the pot down slowly. "What did you say?" "The man who owned this land before us. He buried someone here, a man he owned." Catherine's voice was flat and even, the way someone speaks when they are reading aloud from a list. "He is still there." Maura grabbed her daughter by the shoulders, hard. "Catherine, stop that right now." "His name was Thomas," the girl continued without flinching, without blinking. "He was 31 years old. He was from Georgia. He never saw his children again." Maura shook her. "Stop it! Where did you hear that? Who told you that?" "I didn't hear it," Catherine said. "I know it." Maura looked at her daughter's face for a long, breathless moment. Then she did the only thing she could think to do. She pulled Catherine against her chest and held her there, and she stared at the kitchen wall, and she tried very hard to convince herself that it was nothing. That children said strange things, that it meant nothing. But she could feel Catherine's heartbeat against her own, and it was completely, unnaturally calm. That was the first morning. There would be many more. Patrick came home that evening to find Maura sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, and the expression of a woman who had been holding herself together by sheer force of will all day. She told him what Catherine had said, word for word. Patrick listened without interrupting. Then he looked across the room to where Catherine sat quietly in the corner, reading her Bible, or appearing to read it. "She probably overheard something from the street," he said. "Children pick things up. You know how she is. Don't make more of it than it is." "Patrick," Maura said quietly. Just his name, nothing else. He looked at Catherine again, at her eyes, still and dark and fixed on the page. He did not say another word that night. By the end of that first week, the neighborhood had begun to talk. Catherine walked up to Mrs. Hannigan on the front steps and told her plainly that her son in Philadelphia was going to lose his hand in a factory accident. Mrs. Hannigan laughed it off loudly, the way people laugh when something frightens them and they cannot admit it. She told 2 or 3 women on the block, and they all shook their heads and said what a peculiar child that Doyle girl had always been. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Hannigan received a letter from Philadelphia. Her boy had lost 2 fingers to a press machine on the factory floor. She came to Maura's door before the ink on that letter was even dry, and she was pale as fresh chalk and shaking from her jaw down to her ankles. "How did she know?" she whispered, standing in the doorway, not willing to come inside. "Maura, how in God's name did that child know?" Maura had no answer. She had been searching for one since Tuesday. Patrick began bringing priests around. The first, Father Connolly, a broad and confident man with a silver cross at his collar and 20 years of parish experience behind him, sat across from Catherine at the kitchen table with his hands folded and asked her calmly what she had been telling the neighbors. Catherine looked at him with those quiet, ageless eyes for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "You haven't told your bishop about the money you took from the collection box in February?" Father Connolly stood up so fast his chair hit the floor behind him. He left without putting his coat on. He never came back. The second priest lasted slightly longer. He made it through an entire cup of tea, speaking steadily about the importance of prayer and the dangers of an overactive imagination in children. He was reaching for a second biscuit when Catherine looked up from her corner of the room and said, in a voice pitched just slightly lower than a child's natural voice, "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." Word perfect, flawless liturgical Latin, spoken with an accent she had never been taught, a precision she had never been trained to produce. She had never attended a Latin Mass in her life. She had never been taught a single word of it. The second priest put down his tea and left without the biscuit. "She heard it at church," Patrick told himself. He repeated it like a prayer of his own. He had to tell himself something. The alternative was too large and too dark to hold in the mind of a man who just wanted to believe that his daughter was going to be all right. Then came the night that broke him completely open. He came home late from the docks, bone-tired and smelling of salt and fish, and found Catherine standing perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, arms flat at her sides, eyes wide open, speaking in a voice he had never heard before. It was not a child's voice. It was low and deliberate and measured, the cadence of someone dictating a formal document. "The overseer on the Harrow plantation was named Beaumont," she said, without turning to look at him. "He used a leather strap tied at the end with copper wire. The man called Thomas prayed every night facing east. They took his Bible away in the second year. He made a new one. He scratched the words from memory onto pieces of bark with a bent nail." Patrick crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and grabbed her arm. "Catherine! Catherine, wake up!" She turned and looked at him. his daughter's face, his daughter's eyes, and yet not. "Papa," she said, in her own voice now, small and exhausted.
"I am awake. I am always awake." He held her for a long time. He held her and he prayed with his whole body, every word of every prayer he had ever been taught, and he meant every syllable of every one of them. But even as he prayed, something cold and certain was settling deep in the center of his chest, because he recognized the name. Harrow Plantation. He had heard it before, not recently, long ago, in his father's voice. A conversation Patrick had never been meant to overhear, spoken in the low, flat tone his father reserved only for things that could not be undone and would not be discussed. His father had worked in the South before the war, not as a laborer, as an overseer's assistant on a plantation in Georgia. He had come north after 1865 and never once, in all the years Patrick had known him, spoken a single word about those years. Not one word about what he had seen, what he had been part of. Patrick had buried that knowledge so deep and for so long that it had become almost unreal to him. A story about some other man's father, some other family's shame. "He knows you know, Papa," Catherine said softly against his shoulder. Patrick went cold to his bones. "Who knows?" "Thomas," she said. "He has been waiting. He has been waiting for a very long time." Patrick Doyle was not a man who frightened easily. He had crossed the Atlantic in steerage at 14 years old, with nothing but the clothes on his back. He had taken beatings from men twice his size on the docks and never once backed down. He had buried friends in unmarked paupers' graves without letting himself cry, because there was never time to cry when there was still work to be done the next morning. But in that moment, crouched on the kitchen floor of a tenement on Hanover Street with his 9-year-old daughter in his arms, Patrick Doyle felt something crack open inside himself that he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has lived long enough to understand the difference, was never going to close again. He set Catherine down carefully. He looked at her face, his child. His bright-eyed, quick-laughing girl who used to trace Bible verses with her finger and make his heart want to break from how much he loved her. "Catherine," he said. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "What is happening to you?" She looked at him for a long and quiet moment. Her eyes were tired, deep, old. "I don't know, Papa," she said, "but they won't stop talking." He swallowed hard. They. How many of them? She thought about it. Her small face was careful and serious, the face of someone taking account of a very large number. "More than you can count," she said at last. "There are so many of them, Papa, and they have all been waiting for someone who would finally listen." Patrick didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a candle burned down to a blackened stub and his rosary wound tight around his fist. And he thought about his father. He thought about the things a man carries forward through a family line without ever intending to. The sins that get handed down like old furniture, wrapped in silence and passed from one generation to the next until finally, inevitably, someone breaks open and can no longer keep them inside. By morning, Maura had made a decision. "We are taking her to the doctor," she said. Not a question, not a suggestion. A fact she had already decided while Patrick was staring at the dark. Patrick nodded. He had no better idea. Dr. Elias Crawford was a small, efficient man who ran his practice on Salem Street and prided himself on his absolute rationality. He had studied in Edinburgh. He had read every significant medical text published in the last 2 decades. He did not believe in the supernatural, the occult, or any spiritual disturbance that could not be traced to a clear and demonstrable neurological origin. He lasted 20 minutes with Catherine Doyle. She sat across from him in his examination chair, hands folded neatly in her lap,
answering his questions politely and without hesitation. Yes, she was sleeping. No, she had no pain. Yes, she ate her meals. Then she looked at him with her steady, ancient eyes and said evenly, "You lost a patient last spring, a woman. You told her family it was the fever. It wasn't the fever, Dr. Crawford. And you have known that every day since." He stood up and told Maura to take her daughter home.
Maura stood her ground. "Tell me, what is wrong with my child?"
Crawford straightened his jacket. His hands, Maura noticed with precise attention, were trembling. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "I am not equipped to help you with this."
"Then who is?"
Her voice was iron. Her heart was breaking. He said nothing. He walked to his office door, held it open, and would not meet her eyes. On the street outside, walking home with Catherine's small hand held tightly in hers, Maura Doyle understood with cold and absolute clarity that she was completely alone in this. No doctor, no priest, no neighbor willing to come within 30 feet of their door anymore. Just her and Patrick, and this child who was somehow carrying the voices of the dead inside her body like a wound that would not close, would not be treated, and would not be explained. She gripped Catherine's hand tighter than she meant to. "Does it hurt you, sweetheart?" she asked, her own voice barely holding its shape. "What you hear, does it hurt you?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, watching the street ahead of them with those calm, impossible eyes. Then she looked up at her mother, and for just one fraction of 1 second, Maura saw something flicker behind those eyes, something young and small and frightened. Her daughter. Her real daughter, still alive somewhere deep inside all of this, still in there. "It is very loud, Mama," Catherine said softly. "It is so very loud." And Maura Doyle pressed her lips together and kept walking, and did not let herself cry until they were all the way home, and Catherine could not see her face. October 1869, Boston, Massachusetts. The weeks that followed Catherine's visit to Dr. Crawford passed the way bad things always pass, slowly and with weight. Maura stopped sleeping in the bedroom. She moved a chair to the doorway of Catherine's small room and sat there through the night with her hands folded and her eyes open, listening for the voice shifts, for the low, even cadence that was not her daughter's voice, for the names. There were always names. Patrick tried to pretend otherwise. He went to work every morning before the sun came up, and he came home every evening after the sun went down. And in the space between those two events, he worked his body so completely into exhaustion that by the time he sat down at the kitchen table, there was simply no room left inside him for the things he was refusing to think about. It was not a solution. He knew it was not a solution. But it was what he had. Then came the night Catherine walked into their bedroom at 3 a.m, stood at the foot of their bed, and spoke in a voice that was not hers, deep, deliberate, edged with something that sounded like old grief pressed flat by years of silence. "Patrick Doyle," the voice said through his daughter's mouth. "Your father's hands built the box they buried me in." Patrick was on his feet before he was fully awake. He grabbed Catherine by both arms. She was limp in his grip, eyes half open, unfocused. "Catherine," he said, loud and sharp. "Catherine, wake up right now!" Her eyes slowly came into focus. She looked at him. Just his daughter again, tired and confused. "Papa," she whispered, "why are you shouting?" He set her back down on the bed gently. His hands would not stop shaking for the next 2 hours. He sat in the kitchen and stared at the wall and did not tell Maura what the voice had said. But Maura had heard. She had heard every word. She sat in her chair in the doorway, and she listened to her husband shaking in the kitchen, and she thought about her father-in-law, a quiet, closed man who had come to visit them once, 2 years after the war ended,
and had sat through the entire visit without once making eye contact with another human being. She had never known why. She thought she was beginning to understand. November 1869, Hanover Street, Boston. By November, Catherine had stopped going to school, not because she refused, because the school refused her. Mrs. Albright, the teacher, had sent a note, polite, firm, final. Catherine had disrupted the classroom. She had told the boy beside her things about his father that no child could know. She had made two girls cry with things she had said about their futures. Mrs. Albright wrote that she prayed for the Doyle family, but that Catherine was not welcome back until her condition improved. Maura read the note at the kitchen table. Catherine sat across from her, watching. "I know what it says," Catherine offered quietly. "I know you do," Maura said. She folded the note, put it down, picked it back up. "Does it make you sad, not being able to go back?" Catherine thought about it with the careful seriousness she brought to every question these days. "I miss reading," she said. "They won't let me take the books home." Something in Maura's chest cracked sideways. "I'll find you books," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'll find you as many books as you want." That same week, Maura went to see a woman named Ida Sloane, who lived 4 blocks over and was known, quietly and carefully among certain women in the neighborhood, as someone who understood things that doctors and priests did not. Ida Sloane was 63 years old, born free in Philadelphia, and had lived long enough to have seen things that fell well outside the edges of what polite Boston society was willing to discuss. She took one look at Maura's face on her doorstep and stepped aside without being asked. Maura told her everything, all of it, from the first morning in the kitchen to the night voices to the priests who had fled to the locked school door. Ida Sloane listened without interrupting, without flinching, without the careful blankness people put on their faces when they are humoring someone they believe to be losing their mind. When Maura finished, Ida was quiet for a long moment. "The name Thomas," Ida said finally. "Your child mentioned him first." "Yes," Maura said. "And your husband's father worked in Georgia." "Yes." Ida looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Doyle, what your daughter is carrying is not an illness." Maura's hands tightened in her lap. "Then what is it?" "It is testimony," Ida said. "The dead do not speak without reason. They speak because the living have forgotten what they owe. Someone in your family line is connected to a great harm, a harm that was never answered for. And until it is answered for, or at the very least acknowledged, the voices will not stop." Maura stared at her. "Acknowledged how? My husband's father is dead. Whatever he did, he took it to the grave." "The grave is not the end of a debt," Ida said simply. "Your daughter's body became the place where that debt is being collected. That is not a medical condition. That is a reckoning." Maura left Ida Sloane's house and walked the 4 blocks home without feeling her own feet on the ground. She went inside. She sat across from Catherine, and for the first time since September, she did not ask Catherine to be quiet, or to stop, or to please try to be normal. She said, "Tell me about Thomas." Catherine looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not the frightening shift, not the voice change, but something quieter and deeper, like a door opening inward. "He was a carpenter," Catherine said softly. "Before, back in Georgia. He could make anything from wood. He made his children toys before they were taken away. He made a cradle. They sold the cradle with the baby still in it." Maura closed her eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them. "And Patrick's father," she said carefully, "what did he do?" Catherine's face went very still. "He watched," she said. "He watched, and he wrote it in a ledger, and he never once said stop." She paused. "He was 22 years old. He told himself it was not his business. He told himself that for the rest of his life. The kitchen was completely silent. Outside, someone was shouting in the street. A cartwheel cracked against a cobblestone. The world outside continued to be ordinary and uncaring, the way it always does when something enormous is happening inside a house. "What does Thomas want?" Maura asked. Her voice was a thread. "He wants someone to say his name," Catherine said. "His whole name. The one his mother gave him, not the name they put in the ledger." "What is his whole name?" "Thomas Emmanuel Ware," Catherine said. "Born 1831, outside Macon, Georgia. He had a wife named Ruth and 3 children.
Joseph, 6 years old, Margaret, 4, infant girl, never named before she was sold. Maura pressed her hand flat to her mouth. She held it there. Then she took it down and said clearly, in a voice that did not shake, "Thomas Emmanuel Ware, I hear you. I am saying your name." The candle on the table went out. Not blown out, simply extinguished, the flame collapsing to nothing without a breath of air to explain it. The room went dark for one long, suspended moment. Then Catherine exhaled. One long, slow, deep breath, the kind a person takes when they have been holding themselves rigid for a very long time and are finally allowed to let go. She slumped slightly in her chair and looked at her mother with eyes that were, just for that moment, entirely her own. "Mama," she said in a small and exhausted voice, "I'm so tired." Maura crossed the room in 2 steps, dropped to her knees in front of her daughter's chair, and pulled her in so hard that Catherine made a small, surprised sound. Maura held her daughter's head against her collarbone and pressed her lips to the top of her hair and stayed there, rocking slightly, the way she had when Catherine was an infant and the world was simple enough to be solved by holding someone close enough. She thought it was over. She thought, for 2 whole days she allowed herself to believe, that the naming had been enough, that Thomas Emmanuel Ware had received what he needed and had gone, and that Catherine would come back to herself completely, and that things would slowly begin to return to normal. She was wrong. December 1869, Boston, Massachusetts. 3 days after the candle went out, Catherine woke before dawn and told her father at the breakfast table, with absolute calm, that there were 47 of them. Not just Thomas. 47 voices, 47 names. Patrick set his cup down. "What do you mean, 47? "Your grandfather," Catherine said. "Not just your father's years in Georgia, your grandfather also, before the war. He was there longer. He did more." She paused, looking at the table. "They are connected, Papa." Generation after generation, the same plantation, the same family they worked for, the same harm repeated across 60 years. And each time the men in your family told themselves it was not their business and moved on and never spoke of it and thought they had left it behind. Patrick's chair scraped back from the table so hard it hit the wall. He was on his feet, breathing like he had just run a mile. "That is enough," he said. His voice was low and strained and shaking with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and was probably both of them at once, fighting for the same space in his chest. "Patrick," Maura said carefully, "I said that is enough." He pointed at Catherine, his hand not steady. "I don't know where you are hearing these things. I don't know what is happening to you, but I am not going to sit in my own kitchen and be accused by my 9-year-old daughter of crimes committed by men I never even met." Catherine looked at him. Her face was quiet. Not cold, not the frightening emptiness, just quiet. And she said, without raising her voice even one fraction, "I know you are scared, Papa. They know you are scared too. They were scared too, every single one of them. That is not why they are here." Patrick's hand dropped. Something went out of his posture. The rigidity, the fighting stance. All of it just fell away. And what was left underneath was a man who looked very tired and very young, and very much like a person who has been carrying a weight whose name he was only now beginning to learn. He sat back down. He did not speak. He put his face in his hands. And Catherine reached across the table and placed her small, thin hand on top of his fist. Not speaking, just there. His daughter. Still his daughter, beneath all of it, still reaching for him in the dark. Outside, the December wind hit the tenement windows and found every crack it could. 47 names, and winter had only just begun. January 1870, Boston, Massachusetts. 47 names. Patrick had not slept a full night since Catherine said that number out loud at the breakfast table. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and counted his own heartbeats and tried to make himself believe that there was a rational explanation for all of it, that his daughter was ill in some ordinary, treatable way, that a doctor somewhere had the right word for it, the right medicine, the right answer. He tried. He held on to that hope the way a drowning man holds on to something that might not even be floating. By January, the hope was nearly gone. Maura had stopped trying to explain it away entirely. She had moved past that. She was in a different place now, a place that was harder and quieter and more frightening in some ways, because it was the place you arrive at when you have accepted that something is true and you still have no idea what to do about it. She got up every morning. She made the meals. She watched her daughter. She listened. She was the only one who truly listened, and Catherine knew it, and that knowledge lived in the way Catherine looked at her mother, with a gratitude too large and too grave for a 9-year-old's face. The voices were changing. That was what frightened Maura most in those January weeks. In the beginning, Catherine had spoken names and facts and histories, grim but contained. Now the voices were becoming something more insistent, more physical. Catherine would go rigid at the dinner table, her small body locking up like a seized machine, and when she came back to herself, she would be shaking and unable to speak for several minutes. The names she recited afterward were no longer just from Georgia. They were from Mississippi, from South Carolina, from Virginia, from Louisiana. As if the original 47 had opened a door and now others were pressing through it. Patrick watched his daughter go rigid at the table on a Tuesday evening in January, and something finally broke loose inside him that he had been holding back for 4 months. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the house. He was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, his eyes were red and he smelled of whiskey, and he sat down across from Maura and said, in a voice stripped completely clean of everything but raw honesty, "I cannot do this anymore." Maura looked at him. "You don't have a choice. She needs to be somewhere that can help her, somewhere with doctors who actually know what they are looking at. I cannot watch her keep doing that and do nothing." "There are no doctors who know what they are looking at," Maura said flatly. "We have tried 3. They ran." "There is a hospital," Patrick said. He said it carefully, the way you say a thing you have been afraid to say. "In Danvers, the state lunatic hospital. They have specialists there. They have—" "She is not lunatic," Maura said. Her voice hit the table like a stone dropped from height. "Do not say that word about our daughter." "I know she is not." His voice cracked down the middle. "Maura, I know she is not. But I don't know what else to do. I am standing here watching something happen to my child that I cannot stop and cannot explain and cannot fix, and I am her father, and I am completely useless to her. Do you understand what that feels like?" The kitchen was silent. Catherine was in the other room, asleep, or what passed for sleep these days. Maura looked at her husband's broken face for a long moment. Then she said very quietly,
"Give me 3 more months. 3 months before we consider that. 3 months to try something else."
Patrick asked, "What else is there to try?" Maura had already decided.
"I am going to Georgia," she said.
February 1870, Macon, Georgia. She did not actually go to Georgia. She could not afford the train fare and could not leave Catherine, and Patrick would not have allowed it in any case. But she found the next best thing, a man named Reverend Elias Morrow, a formerly enslaved minister from Macon who had come north after the war and now ran a small congregation out of a rented room on Cambridge Street. Ida Sloane had given her his name, written on a folded piece of paper, pressed into her hand with both of Ida's wrapped around it.
"He will know the name Harrow Plantation," Ida had said. "He will know what you are carrying."
Reverend Morrow was 51 years old, lean and careful in his movements, with a stillness about him that was not the stillness of a quiet man, but the stillness of a man who had learned, at great cost, to be still. He met Maura on a Thursday afternoon and listened to her for 40 minutes without saying a single word. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at his own hands for a moment.
"Harrow Plantation," he said. "I know it. I was born on it." The air went out of the room. Maura stared at him. "Thomas Emmanuel Ware," he continued slowly. "I knew that name before you said it. He was my mother's brother, my great-uncle. He disappeared in 1858. The family was told he died of fever."
He paused. "We always knew that was a lie."
Maura's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on her knees. "Reverend Morrow," she said carefully, "my daughter has been saying his name since September. She is 9 years old. She has never been south of Connecticut in her life. She described details about Thomas details that no one here could possibly know."
Morrow looked at her with eyes that had seen enough of the world's capacity for horror, that this new piece of it did not destroy him. It simply settled into place alongside everything else he already knew.
"What has she said about how he died?" he asked quietly. Maura told him. Morrow nodded slowly.
"That is consistent," he said. "That is consistent with what we suspected."
He stood up and moved to the window, his back to her.
"Mrs. Doyle, your husband's family did not simply witness what happened at Harrow. The ledger your daughter described, that ledger was used to transfer ownership. Names recorded, transactions made legal, crimes made permanent on paper. The man who kept that ledger gave those crimes the appearance of legitimacy. He made them real in the eyes of the law. Without men like him, the system could not have functioned." He turned back to face her. "Your daughter is not ill. She is a witness. She is being used as a vessel for testimony because the testimony has nowhere else to go. The courts ignored it, the church ignored it, the law buried it, and the men responsible took their silence to the grave and passed it down as inheritance." He looked at her steadily. "But testimony does not die. It waits." Maura rode home on the streetcar with her hands in her lap and Morrow's words sitting in her chest like something with weight and temperature. She was not frightened anymore, or rather, she was frightened in a completely different way now. Not frightened of Catherine, frightened for her. Frightened of what it meant that a 9-year-old child's body had become the only available courtroom for 60 years of unanswered crimes. She got home to find Patrick standing in the kitchen doorway with a look on his face that told her immediately something had happened.
"She did it again," he said. "The rigid thing."
But this time, she didn't come out of it for almost 20 minutes. Maura pushed past him. Catherine was sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea in front of her that she was not drinking. Her face was pale and exhausted, deeply exhausted. the exhaustion of someone who has been doing physical labor without stop. Maura sat across from her. "How many names today?" she asked. Catherine looked at her. 11 new ones, she said. "But there was one, Mama. There was one I could not say out loud. A woman. She kept showing me her hands. Her hands were—" She stopped. She swallowed. She kept saying, "Tell them what they made us build. Tell them what our hands built while they told the world they built it themselves." Maura said, "What did they build?" "Everything," Catherine said simply. "The churches, the courthouses, the hospitals, the roads, all of it. With their hands."
And every stone that went up had a name attached to it that the records do not show. She wants the names in the record. Maura reached across the table and took Catherine's hands in hers and held them the way Maura had held her attention, completely, without looking away. "We will get the names in the record," she said. "I don't know how yet, but we will." Catherine looked at her mother, and for a moment, just a moment, something like relief moved through her face. Real relief. The relief of being believed. Then her eyes went wide. She gripped her mother's hand so hard that Maura winced. Her back went straight. Her head tilted back at an angle that was wrong. Too far, too fast. And when her voice came, it was not Catherine's voice, and it was not the low, measured tone of Thomas Emmanuel Ware. It was a voice that was frightened, urgent, cracking with something that had been compressed for years and was now forcing its way out all at once. "The ledger is real," the voice said through Catherine's mouth, rapid and pressured, nothing like the careful cadence of before. "The ledger still exists. It was not destroyed. He kept it. He hid it. It is in the wall of the house on Hanover Street, left wall of the kitchen, third brick from the floor. It has been there since 1857. Get it out. Get the names out. They deserve to be found. They all deserve to be found." Then silence. Catherine slumped forward. Maura caught her. Patrick, who had been standing in the doorway the whole time, was completely white. He turned slowly and looked at the left wall of the kitchen. He stared at it for a long time without moving. His breathing was audible across the room. Then he walked to the corner where he kept his tools. He picked up a chisel. He turned back to the wall. "Patrick," Maura said. He looked at her. His jaw was set. His eyes were wet. "If it is in there," he said, "then I am going to find it." He raised the chisel to the third brick from the floor. February 1870, Hanover Street, Boston. The chisel hit the mortar, and the sound filled the kitchen like a gunshot. Maura flinched. Catherine, still slumped in the chair, did not react at all. Patrick worked in silence, his jaw locked, his hands moving with the mechanical steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is not allowing himself to think past the next movement. The first brick resisted. The second came loose with a grinding scrape that left dust on Patrick's shirt and hands. He did not stop. He did not look back at Maura, and Maura did not tell him to stop again, because somewhere deep and animal inside her, she needed to know too. She needed to know if the wall was going to answer back. The third brick came out in 2 pieces. Patrick set them down on the floor carefully, almost gently, as if he were handling something sacred or something dangerous. At that moment, both seemed equally possible. He reached into the dark space behind the wall with his bare hand. His knuckles scraped against rough stone, and then his fingers found something that was not stone. He pulled it out slowly, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a length of cord that had gone stiff and brown with age. He held it in both hands and stared at it for a long moment without moving. Maura crossed the kitchen and stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Patrick set the bundle on the table. He worked at the cord with fingers that were not entirely steady. The oilcloth fell open.
Inside was a small ledger, not large, not impressive, the kind of plain-bound book a clerk might carry in a coat pocket. The cover was water-stained and the pages had swelled and pressed together, but when Patrick opened it, the ink was still legible. Column after column, page after page, names, dates, transactions, amounts paid, real names, real people. Reduced to entries in a column, bought and recorded and carried forward into the law of the land by the neat, careful handwriting of a man who had told himself, for the rest of his living days, that it was not his business. Patrick's grandfather's handwriting. Unmistakably, Patrick had seen it before on old letters kept in a box under his parents' bed, letters he had read as a boy without understanding what they contained. He recognized the particular looping shape of the capital letters, the precise, tight way the numbers were formed. He would have known that handwriting in the dark. He sat down. He sat down hard, the way a man sits when his legs stop working without warning. He put the ledger flat on the table and pressed both hands against it and stared at it and did not say anything for a very long time. 61 names, Catherine said from her chair. Both Patrick and Maura turned to look at her. She was sitting upright now, watching them with her quiet, ancient eyes. Not in a trance, not speaking in another voice. Just Catherine, small and pale and exhausted, watching her father hold the weight of what his family had done. "I counted them," she said.
While they were all still talking, 61 names in that ledger. Most of them are still waiting. They thought when you found the ledger, it would be enough. But it is not enough just to find it. She looked at her father directly. "What you do with it is the part that matters." Patrick looked at his daughter. He looked at the ledger. He was quiet for so long that the candle had burned visibly lower before he spoke. "What am I supposed to do with it?" he asked. His voice was rough and low. "Who do I take this to? Who is going to care about a ledger from a Georgia plantation brought in by an Irish dock worker from a tenement in Boston?" "Reverend Morrow," Maura said immediately. She said it without hesitation because she had already been turning it over in her mind, already building the path forward while Patrick was still absorbing the fact that the wall had been telling the truth. "He was born on that plantation. Thomas Emmanuel Ware was his mother's brother. He has the right to those names more than anyone. We take it to him." Patrick looked at her. Something moved through his face that was not quite peace and not quite relief, and was perhaps the closest thing to both that a man can feel when the thing he has been running from for months has finally caught him completely, and he finds that the catching, somehow, hurts less than the running. "All right," he said. "We take it tomorrow." March 1870. Cambridge Street, Boston. Reverend Morrow held the ledger in both hands and did not speak for a very long time. He stood at the window of his small office above the congregation room, the ledger open to the first page, and Maura watched his face move through things she could not name. Recognition, grief, fury, and beneath all of it, something that looked like the hard-edged satisfaction of a man who has spent a long time being told that the evidence does not exist and is now holding it in his own hands. 61 names, he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "My daughter says 61, Patrick said from the chair across the room. He had come this time. Maura had not asked him to. He had simply put on his coat and walked with her, and that had meant more to her than anything he could have said. Morrow turned from the window. He looked at Patrick steadily. "Mr. Doyle, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead," Patrick said. "Your family carried this, participated in it, documented it, and then buried it in a wall and pretended it never happened. I am not asking you to apologize for men who are dead. I am asking you, what are you prepared to do now that it is in your hands?" The room was very still.
Patrick sat with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at Morrow. "Whatever you need," he said. "Whatever you need me to do." "I'm not going to be another man in my family who decides this is not his business." Morrow held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has learned to take people at their word only after watching their actions, and who is choosing, right now, to begin watching. April 1870, Danvers, Massachusetts. Catherine did not get better. That was the part that the naming, the ledger, and the meetings with Morrow did not fix. The voices quieted after the ledger was found, quieted but did not stop. New ones came, older ones, voices from further back, from other states, other decades, other crimes that had no ledger and no documentation and no evidence except the testimony of the dead pressing through the body of a 9-year-old girl in a tenement kitchen in Boston. By April, Catherine was losing weight. She was not eating properly because she frequently could not sit through a meal without going rigid. She was not sleeping because the voices did not recognize the difference between waking hours and sleeping ones. She was disappearing inside herself in increments, and Morrow watched it happening and felt the terror of it every single day and could not stop it. It was Reverend Morrow who finally said what Mora had been refusing to say. He came to the house on a Thursday and sat with both Patrick and Mora at the table, without Catherine present, and he laid it out plainly and without softening. "She is being consumed," he said. "Whatever is working through her, it is taking more than she can give. Children are not built to carry the testimony of 60 years of collective suffering. She needs medical care, not because she is a lunatic. She is not, but because her body is failing under the weight of this. And if you do not get her proper care, the voices will simply take everything she has left." Patrick and Mora looked at each other across the table. The look that passes between two people who have both known the same terrible thing for a long time and have both been waiting for the other one to say it first. "Danvers," Mora said quietly. The word she had been holding back for months. "They have a physician there," Morrow said. "A Dr. Warren. He is not like Crawford. He does not run. I have spoken to him already without using Catherine's name. He is willing to see her." Mora's head came up sharply. "You spoke to him already?" "I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you," Morrow said simply. "I did not want to offer you a door that would not open." Patrick reached across the table and gripped Morrow's hand. He did not have words for it. Morrow accepted the grip without ceremony, the way men do when words are insufficient, and they both know it. June 1870, Danvers State Hospital, Massachusetts. Dr. Marcus Warren was not what Mora had expected. He was younger than she had imagined, mid-30s, with the kind of eyes that paid attention in the specific way of someone who has trained himself to observe without immediately categorizing what he sees. He met Catherine without a clipboard, without the clinical distance Mora had come to dread in every doctor they had previously encountered. He simply sat across from her and said, "I hear you have a lot going on inside your head." Catherine looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You lost your sister." Warren did not flinch. He said, "Yes, I did." "She says you should stop blaming yourself for the diagnosis," Catherine said. "She says you could not have known." Warren was quiet for a very long moment. He looked at Catherine with an expression that had moved past professional assessment entirely into something raw and personal. Then he blinked once, slowly, and said in a voice that was very carefully controlled, "Thank you." It was the first time any medical professional had thanked Catherine for something she could not help doing. Mora stood in the doorway and felt something loosen inside her chest that had been wound tight since September. Warren admitted Catherine that same week, not to a ward,
to a private room arranged with Morrow's help and paid for partially through the congregation's discretionary funds in a gesture that Patrick tried to refuse and Morrow refused to let him refuse. Warren documented everything. He sat with Catherine for hours at a time, recording names and dates and testimonies with the careful seriousness of someone who understood that what he was hearing was not illness. He wrote in his case notes, in language that was as measured and professional as he could make it, that his patient appeared to be functioning as an involuntary repository for historical testimony of significant accuracy, the origins of which could not be explained by any conventional medical framework available to him. He showed those notes to no one outside Danvers. He knew what would happen to him if he did. January 1871, Danvers State Hospital. Catherine was 9 years old when the photograph was taken. Warren had requested it as part of his documentation, in keeping with the hospital's standard practices. The photographer set up his equipment in the corridor outside her room, and Catherine sat in the chair they brought out for her, hands folded in her lap, spine straight. She had lost more weight by then. Her face was thinner, but her eyes were exactly what they had always been since September of 1869, deep and still, and carrying something behind them that had no right to be living in the eyes of a child. The photograph was taken. The flash went off. The photographer looked down at his equipment, then back up at Catherine, and then he stepped backward without meaning to, his heel catching the edge of the equipment case. He did not say what he had seen in the viewfinder. He packed his things and left very quickly and told the orderly on his way out that he would not be coming back to this particular room. Warren looked at the developed photograph 3 days later, alone in his office, with the door closed. He sat with it for a long time. He had seen a great many things in his years at Danvers that had tested the limits of what he believed to be possible. He looked at the eyes in the photograph and understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has stopped pretending that the boundaries of science are the same as the boundaries of reality, that what he was looking at was not a 9-year-old girl staring at a camera. It was every person whose name she had carried, looking out through her, looking directly into the future, daring whoever saw this image to look away. He did not look away. March 1871, Danvers State Hospital. Catherine Doyle died on a Tuesday morning in March, with her mother holding one hand and her father holding the other, and Reverend Elias Morrow standing at the foot of the bed with his head bowed and his lips moving in a prayer that was half from the Bible and half from something older than the Bible, something that came from a tradition that had survived everything the last century had tried to do to it. She did not die in pain. That was the thing Maura held on to afterward, through all the years that came after. Catherine did not die in pain. She simply became quieter over the course of that last morning, her breathing slowing, the way a river slows when it finally reaches wide water, her body releasing its grip on the weight it had been carrying, with what looked, in the end, almost like relief. Her last words were spoken clearly and without effort, in her own voice, which was the voice of a 9-year-old girl from a tenement on Hanover Street who loved to read and used to trace Bible verses with her finger, and had once made her father feel like his heart would break from how much he loved her. She said, "They are saying thank you." Then she said, "I am so tired, Mama." Then she was gone. The autopsy found nothing. Warren conducted it himself and wrote the report himself and sat with it himself for 3 days before he could file it, because what it contained was the absence of any explanation. Organs without fault, no disease, no deterioration that could be named or categorized or assigned a cause. Her brain showed patterns he had never seen in any other specimen in his career. He wrote that down carefully in clinical language, and he filed it, and he spent the rest of his medical career quietly, privately, in the margins of his other work, trying to understand what he had seen. Reverend Morrow took the ledger to Philadelphia the following month. He worked for 11 years in courtrooms that did not want to hear him, and newspapers that declined to print him, and churches that turned him away from their doors, until he found the ones that would listen. He found historians. He found archivists. He found the descendants of some of the 61 names. He read those names aloud in public, in front of witnesses, on the record, for the first time in history. He lived long enough to see every name in that ledger acknowledged in writing and entered into the official historical record of Harrow Plantation, Macon, Georgia. He died in 1901. He left the ledger to the congregation. They kept it in a glass case. Patrick Doyle lived another 30 years. He never spoke publicly about Catherine, but he kept her photograph on the wall above the kitchen table in every apartment they moved to after Hanover Street for the rest of his life. In his final years, his grandchildren would ask him who the girl in the photograph was, this serious, thin-faced child with the deep and ageless eyes. He would tell them her name. He would tell them that she had been very brave. He would tell them that she had carried something that was not hers to carry, and had carried it anyway, because there was no one else to carry it, and because the people who needed to be heard deserved to be heard, and some debts do not stay buried, no matter how deep the grave. He never once told them she was gone. He said she was resting. He believed that. Maura believed it too. And somewhere between what can be explained and what cannot, between the living and the dead, between the testimony that gets recorded and the testimony that gets buried in walls and ledgers and family silences, Catherine Mary Doyle, 9 years old, Boston, Massachusetts, rested in the knowledge that she had been the voice for all the voices that had been taken away. And every name she had ever spoken was now, finally, in the record. Every single one.